Good afternoon. Now, even people online are hopefully hearing me. I'm pausing. Seems to be, I get a thumbs up from the back. When you did not hear what I was saying, I was introducing myself. My name is Markus Stock. I'm the principal of UC. I spoke the land acknowledgement, which is very important in our institution. And now I'm returning to the text here. In that University College is very pleased to host the Stubbs Lecture for the 2023-24 academic year. The Stubbs Lecture series was established in 1988 by Helen Eunice Stubbs, a graduate of University College, in honor of her father, Samuel James Stubbs, also a UC graduate. The lecture commemorates his love of classics and of English literature. The Stubbs Lecture alternates between these themes annually, and this is a classics year. We're extremely honored to have Dr. Joy Connolly deliver the Stubbs Lecture this year. Today's lecture is entitled Ancient Pasts for the Whole Planet. On behalf of the college, I'd like to welcome our speaker and our audiences in the Paul Cadario Conference Center at Croft Chapter House and on their screens. We're looking forward to the talk that our esteemed guest will be delivering tonight. Let me add some quick housekeeping notes, which are always helpful because this is a hybrid event. This lecture is live recorded. For those attending in person, a microphone will be passed around during the Q&A portion of today's lecture. Please raise your hand, and once the moderator calls on you, please wait for the microphone to ask a question. So I'm sure we'll all be very eager to discuss this lecture after the lecture, but please wait for the microphone to come around so that the remote audiences can hear you. For those attending virtually, live closed captioning is available for this event. This option can be turned on by clicking the closed captioning icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please use the Q&A function in Zoom to submit your questions. So please don't unmute, but type your question into the chat. There is a live moderator here in the room. I'd like to thank UC Professor Siobhan O'Flynn for moderating and monitoring the online portion of the Q&A, and she will bring your question to the attention of the speaker and the audience here. So much for housekeeping, and now I would like to call upon my colleague, Alison Keith, Professor of Classics and Director of the Jackman Humanities Institute, to more formally introduce our distinguished speaker.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's an absolute honor and privilege to introduce Joy Connolly, our distinguished speaker, President of the American Council of Learned Societies, and the 2024 S.J. Stubbs Lecturer in Classics at University College in the University of Toronto. Professor Connolly earned an A.B. in Classics from Princeton University and a Ph.D. in Classical Studies from the University of Pennsylvania. She held professorships at the universities of at the University of Washington and at Stanford University before moving to NYU, New York University in 2004. There, she rose through the professorial ranks and began her career in academic leadership when she served as Dean for the Humanities in the Faculty of Arts and Science and Director of the College Core Curriculum, both at NYU. In 2016, she moved to the Graduate Center of the City University of New York as provost, and eventually capped her career there as interim president before moving to the American Council of Learned Societies, the ACLS, in 2019. Professor Connolly works mainly on Roman ideas about politics, rhetoric, and aesthetics, their reception in 18th and 19th century England and America, and their ongoing relevance for contemporary democratic life. Her first book, The State of Speech, was published by Princeton University Press in 2007 and placed the ability to communicate at the heart of Roman ideals of citizenship. Her second book, The Life of Roman Republicanism, also published by Princeton, appeared in 2014 and examines key themes and affects in Roman Republican political thought, such as freedom, recognition, antagonism, self-knowledge, irony, and imagination. In addition to her books, she's written over 70 articles, book reviews, and essays, and her writing has appeared in such venues as the New York Times Book Review, The Independent, The Village Voice, The Times Literary Supplement, The Chronicle of Higher Education, among others. Her awards and honors include fellowships at Stanford University, the Princeton University Center for Human Values, and the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Study, and she was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2021. Professor Connolly speaks and writes regularly about the future of the humanities and the necessity of public funding for higher education as a keystone for a robust democracy, ideals I believe we can all get behind ourselves. Her current book, tentatively entitled Greece and Rome, all one word, capital G, capital R, advocates for an emergent, trans-regional, transcultural approach to the study of ancient societies. And I hope very much that we will hear something from that work this afternoon. So without further ado, let me turn over the floor to Professor Joy Connolly, who will speak to us today about ancient pasts for the whole planet. Professor Connolly.
Thank you. Thanks, Allison. Thank you so much. I failed to ask one question about the technology, and that is, if I do move around, will the people online be able to see me? Aha, all right, good. I always feel a bit trapped behind a podium, so I try to avoid it when I can. I want to thank Marcus, to thank Allison for a kind introduction, to thank all of you for coming, and thanks to the subfamilies for their legacy of supporting the humanities. And I will do what I think is an appropriate visitor's duty by saying, if any of you are considering such a gift to the University of Toronto or to support the humanities in any way, please do. We can't survive without you, but your gift includes not just funds, but your presence and your interests. So thank you again very much for coming and sharing your time with us today, and with me in particular. And today I want to use what we call the classical world, and that phrase I want to kind of ring in your head for a bit as you look at this picture and as you look at this quotation from the scholar of many different fields, literary and cultural studies, critical thought, critical theory, Sylvia Wynter. And I'll just read it actually, since I've asked you to look at it. There is no order in the world that can exist or hold together without a founding story. The question for academia in the 21st century is, will you make space within it to make a new foundation? So it's with that in mind that I want to use what we call the classical world as a test case to think about the future, but in light of a very old question, a different question. Back in the evolving, emergent German university of the late 18th century, scholars were starting to ask, what, if anything, scholars owe the public? Johann Gottlieb Fichte tackled this question as a very young professor at Jena in his lectures concerning the scholar's vocation. He asked, what is the scholar's place in the scheme of things? What relation do scholars have to each other and to other men in general, especially various classes of men? What do they owe? Owe is a really strong word, but like Fichte, I want us to ask and think together about what the humanistic study of the past owes and to whom it owes. And some of you may be thinking right away, nothing to no one, on the premise, which is completely reasonable, that once we identify obligation, we start constraining ourselves. We lose that freedom that we might think is key to scholarly inquiry. And this is freedom, of course, in the US we see under threat now every day from all quarters. But it's my belief, and we may disagree on this, which is good if we talk it through, it's my belief that it's precisely the scholarly tradition of parrying the question of what we owe with allusions to the importance of free curiosity and the play of free knowledge that's made us dangerously vulnerable to accusations of arrogance and selfishness and disconnection from human concerns and all the rest. So I think identifying and openly espousing obligations, what are we doing, what we're doing for, and for whom this will serve us better, if we can answer that question more clearly. So I'm going to think about this, as I said, with respect to the classical world. Now, this phrase is so familiar now that it can be difficult to gain critical purchase on it, but it's a relatively recent invention, this idea of the classical world. The notion of a coherent world, meaning, and this is the conventional definition, so bear with me if you disagree with it, also a good thing, but the idea of a coherent classical world, meaning Greek and Latin speaking societies and cultures from roughly the 8th century BCE, the period associated with Homeric epic, to roughly the 4th or 5th century CE, depending on how you date the decline of the Roman Empire, if that's key to your sense of what the classical is, which it is for most people. This assumed its current meaning in that late 18th century German university, of which Fichte was a part, when scholars created Altertumswissenschaft, the science or scholarship of an antiquity that they roughly demarcated on this map in the little box in the circle on the upper left. But I wanted to gain a sense of locality and globe here in this image found on the internet. Along with that, Altertumswissenschaft, on this demarcated antiquity up here, these initial emergent classicists built all the apparatus of institutionalization. So they built departments and journals and conferences, and of course, very close to my heart and mind now, they built learned societies. Classical texts on which or around which classical studies as a discipline was built exist in that discipline form we know today because of an earlier development, right? And I know I'm covering ground a lot of us know, but I still think it's worth laying out. Because in the 12th century, those texts started to be called upon to help a growing number of European men, I should say, develop a formal pedagogical and then gradually a self-consciously rational public discourse, increasingly distinct from, and sometimes in opposition to, the familiar hierarchies that ordered their lives of the Catholic Church and the nobility. The scholarly tools that became the bedrock of classical studies, especially philological tools, knowing what Latin and Greek words meant. And at the same time, of course, these became the foundation of the emergent European university. These were developed to answer, really, I think to us, sometimes shockingly urgent and pressing public debate questions. Early modern questions about public matters of politics and religion. Above all, the need to determine what constitutes legitimate state power, what constitutes or what is a secular language of authority as opposed to a religious one. How do we distinguish false text from accurate ones, false readings from accurate readings? It was with these questions of ethics, epistemology, and politics that the discipline of classical studies arises. And so this is the traditional origin story. The traditional origin story begins here from these concerns. For those people seeking alternatives to monarchy and the church, Latin and then Greek texts, once Manuel Chrysoloras came from Constantinople to Florence in 1396 to teach Greek, these texts, Latin and Greek texts, proved immensely useful because they helped introduce new terms and values of public life while offering the benefit, absolutely crucial at the time because they're pushing back against existing structures of authority, the benefit of an anchor in the legitimacy conferring Greek and Roman past. The material remains, of course, of which were visible to people inhabiting what had been Roman cities and Roman roads. From the 14th century, as growing numbers of well-off people sought to exercise legitimate authority in their towns and their cities and emergent states, Latin and Greek texts gave us, to many at the time, surprisingly effective counterbalance to the church and ultimately helped replace the order of the church and the state and the believer with the self-governing subject of the state, and began to provide technologies and languages of values to support the education and the formation, the development, and the activity of these people who could now call themselves selves in a language of Latin and Greek apart from, or at least distinct from, the language of the church. Latin historiography and rhetoric proved especially valuable to these self-governing urban city-states and the civic consciousness they sought to promote, especially in places like northern Italy, Leonardo Bruni's 12-volume History of the Florentine People, which came out in 1442, is a good example of the heroic framework for writing local history, so important for instilling civic consciousness, that the historians, the Roman historians, Livy and Sallust, active almost 1500 years before, had made available. As markets opened up and social mobility increased, instruction in the ars dictaminis, the art of letter writing, and works on personal style, like Castiglione's 1528 Art of the Courtier, offered aspiring men access to authoritative styles of professional self-expression and social capital. From Coluccio Salutati's On Tyrants, came out in 1400, to Machiavelli's, better known, I would say, Discourses on Livy in 1531. These works are products of what the Johns Hopkins classicist Chris Celenza has called a dialogical thought world, where readers could form personal relationships with and engage in dialogue and debate with ancient thinkers. And knowledge of the languages in which these texts were written also made possible the close engagement with Christian scripture that animated early Protestant thought. Scholars at the University of Bologna and then other places fostered the study of Roman law, which aided local governance in a very practical way and played various roles in the struggle for legitimate authority among Pope, local nobles, and the Holy Roman Emperor. Pier Paolo Virgilio, who died in 1445, he was an early biographer of Petrarch, argued that learning Latin and Greek literature together made the perfect stepping stone to becoming both a citizen and a philosopher, because learning Latin and Greek brings together the two arts of eloquence and philosophical reasoning that Plato, back in the 4th century BCE, had tried to split apart. So thinking about all these appropriations and configurations of Latin and Greek texts and their purpose, there's a confident, almost redemptive quality to these early modern scholars' engagement with Greek and Latin texts, in their belief that the studia humanitatis, the study or the studies of humanity, could help save both the state and the self, and that modern studia could both assimilate and surpass ancient texts. This is the origin story, what I've just given you, a summary in the last few minutes, retold and retold in many books over the years. I was going to say most recently, but this probably isn't the most recent incarnation. These are two, certainly not the Skinner book, which came out in the 70s, but two examples of texts influenced by what we call Cambridge School scholarship, doing contextual intellectual history, influenced by Quentin Skinner himself and colleagues like John Pocock. But I want to say that many departments of classical studies today continue to proclaim on their websites that classical texts, Greek and Latin texts, are worth studying, mainly because they represent a tradition of thought that is the ancestor of European and North American or Western thought. So at Harvard, the website says, the wider worlds of ancient Greece and Rome, whether textual or material, conceptual or tangible, are worthy of study in their own right, demanding careful analysis and criticism. More than that, I think that's a telling phrase, if we're to understand the world in which we live, a deep familiarity with our classical, capital C, legacy is vital. Today, the engagement of the classics matters more than ever, as the humanities everywhere rally to extend our knowledge and our values, the building blocks of human civilization, to curate our future as fellow occupants of a rapidly degrading planet. Lots of hours there in that talk of classical legacy. At Kansas, a little shorter, are you looking to delve into some of the greatest works of philosophy and to examine the ancient models of the US Constitution? Then Classics is for you. In these websites, we glimpse another important defining aspect of classical texts. They constitute, and I mentioned this really briefly a minute ago, they constitute half a dialogue into which, in principle, any reader can enter. And that's distinctive because it talks to itself over time. It doubles back on itself over time. The dialogical thought world of the early modern humanists mirrored, and the form in which they published mirrored the transhistorical dialogues among the texts that they edited and published. Well, both the genetic and dialogic axioms on which classical studies rests in my brief presentation of its genesis might strike us as conservative or even coercive constraints. A tradition, it talks to itself, it's linked to a particular set of readers over time. But Hannah Arendt, who's pictured behind me in a fabulous picture that they don't make intellectuals like this anymore, we might think. Hannah Arendt, for one, did not see it that way. She didn't see this as a conservative constraint. On the contrary, she argued that the repetition, that the encounter of old text and new reader over time is a crucial driver in the genesis of genuinely novel thinking. Thinking that, she said, is generative, but grounded in the world we share in common. This was a phenomenon she thought was crucial to humanity's survival as a collective, and that is amplified by readers' knowledge, their self-consciousness, that they belong in this conversation, this set of readerly encounters over centuries, that it connects humans on an ethical level as well as an intellectual one, and creates attachments among them over time and space. And you can imagine Arendt's experience, displaced by the Nazis, experiencing World War II, very alive to the effect of displacement and the need for roots and for grounding to push back against the powers of violent displacement. So this was the world of preservation, the world of tradition that Arendt worried as she was writing through the 50s and 60s, sometimes in some very, in modes very blind to the social conflicts going on around her. But it was the world she worried was vanishing, and it was the world she sought to save. She warned about the 20th century habit of violently pushing the past aside in favor of a bright new future. She linked this habit with the rise of modern authoritarianism and totalitarianism, and she rendered in what, in a kind of countercultural moment now, or feel now, she renders the act of reading Greek and Latin texts an entry into a conversation with another that awakens us to our need for others. She really found she discovered in the act of reading, especially texts far away from us in time and space, she found in that, or argued, claimed for it, great ethical power to awaken us, as I said, to our need for others. Hers is really akin, and this might come as a surprise if you know the work of the historian I'm about to refer to, but her thinking is really akin to the recent work, the call by the historian Saidiya Hartman, to do history as an act of care for the past and for those who have gone before. In this view, I think a view they share for all their many differences, Hartman and Arendt, reading past texts by embedding us in their alien particularity enjoins us literally to fall in love with the world. So the question, when I say we now, I really mean people studying Greek and Latin, people who define themselves as classicists or associated with classical studies. The question we've been asking now pretty much all my professional life for several decades, I'll say, but with really renewed urgency and seriousness since 2020. We've been asking who belongs to this world and who's feeling like they don't belong to this world. Who belongs and feels as though they don't, and who is told they don't belong to this conversation, to these acts of engaged reading. The world whose loss that Arendt so feared is the same world that James Baldwin, and also intellectuals like they don't make them anymore, it's the same world James Baldwin viewed from a distance, with a mix of deep desire, pain, irony, frustration, and rage. Reflecting on the Swiss village that he lived in the summer of 1951, Baldwin wrote, "This village, even were it incomparably more remote and incredibly more primitive, is the West onto which I have been so strangely grafted. These people cannot be, from the point of view of power, strangers anywhere in the world. They have made the modern world, in effect, even if they do not know it. The most illiterate among them is related, in a way I am not, to Dante, Shakespeare, Michelangelo, Aeschylus, Da Vinci, Rembrandt, and Racine. The cathedral at Chartres says something to them, which it cannot say to me. Out of their hymns and dances come Beethoven and Bach. Go back a few centuries, and they are in their full glory. But I am in Africa, watching the conquerors arrive." Baldwin reminds us with these and other many other comments and essays he made along these lines through his career that the turn to Greek and Roman texts in early modernity seems like a liberatory development in its local and regional context. And so it was, and he didn't deny that, for many men and even some women as well. But when we take a step back from the local and the regional, when we consider early modern humanist scholarship in its global context, and we see that its didactic and legal and pedagogical texts were deployed to advance a narrative where Europeans dominated the rest of the world that was not European and therefore not civilized and not fully human. And we begin to see the role, the crucial role, the really sine qua non role that these texts played in those claims. What I'm talking about is the Great Divergence, as it's been called for 10 or 15 years now, the start of European exploration, extraction, and colonization of lands around the world. Key to the evolution of the economy that rapidly dominated this world was the development of an epistemology emanating from scholars in Europe, a new universalist ideal of man. Classical texts gave flesh and soul and emotional attachment to that ideal, that man with a capital M. Using these texts and then anointing them as the basis for all human learning did the political work of anchoring Europeans in the tradition of the best, of the aspirational, the dominant, even of the act of saying what the best was itself, the act of ordering knowledge itself. Earlier scholars and poets had already given a name to the relation of European readers to Latin and Greek texts. Familiar, I imagine, to many of you, translatio studii, the transmission of studies that grounded and blessed the new emerging states of Europe. As far back as the 1170s, the French poet Chrétien de Troyes had written, "Our books have taught us that Greece had the first fame of chivalry and learning. Then came chivalry to Rome and the sum of learning, which now is come to France. God grant that it remain there and that it find the place so pleasant that it will never depart." The philosopher Anthony Appiah has described translatio studii as the notion of Western civilization as a golden nugget. And this is his image. It's a story that of things, something being passed one to the other in a coherent whole that helps demarcate Christian Europe and distinguish it from the Islamic East, despite the fact, of course, as he points out, that Aristotle and other Greek texts central to this operation only existed and were only accessible thanks to the labor of Muslim scholars. Well, by naming itself heir to the largest scale iteration of Translatio Studii, early modern Europe made itself the place where history always happened, but was made to happen to other people. The 1550 Valladolid debate, where the humanist friar Sepulveda, Juan Gines Sepulveda behind me, drew on Aristotle and biblical scripture to argue that indigenous Americans were by nature unable to govern themselves, is a powerful example of how Europeans rooted their claim of superiority and their acts of violent superiority over others in their privileged exchange with Greek and Roman texts and ideas. The man in this story, the human person in this story, is and the story doesn't make sense unless this is true, is European and Christian and male. Indigenous Mexicans are neither European nor Christian, and their very humanity in Sepulveda's representation is a matter that only Europeans can decide on, not them, because of their natural incapacities, as he argued. So now we'll speed up the story a little bit. By the time the modern university was established in the early 1800s, the emergent classicists of Germany, where I started, defined the study of ancient cultures as limited to Greece and Rome, and I'm beginning to get to the point where I can put it all in one word, on the ground that other cultures were simply and absolutely not worth studying. In lectures given to generations of students, really generations of students who constituted the civil society of Germany from 1785 to 1823, Friedrich August Wolff, behind me, I hope, yes, there he is, claimed that the ancient nations of Asia had left behind insufficient evidence for scholars to study. And I quote, "Not a single people before and alongside the Greeks advanced to a learned or scientific culture, and none of them preserved a body of literature," end quote. But the worlds Wolff chose, and he knew better, He did not speak out of ignorance. The worlds that Woolf chose to unsee did sometimes intrude and required him to acknowledge them even in the act of dismissing them. He wrote, if we want to, and I'm intrigued by the if here because it's clearly the answer is yes. If we want to preserve a homogeneous whole in ancient studies, Altertumskunde, we can only take the Greeks and Romans. We must exclude the others, he said. End quote. His work placed non-Romans and non-Greeks beyond the ken of proper classical scholarship, but did so by citing irreconcilable differences in language and custom between what he called Oriental nations and what another German, Oswald Spengler, would soon call the West. Poets and philosophers around Woolf and his colleagues tended to agree, and some had already helped clear the ground. In his Ideas on the Philosophy of the History of Humanity, which he finished in 1791, Herder praised the Greeks for, and I quote, keeping free from admixture with alien nations. And he remarked that the inland nations, and he was thinking about Asia, were either stalled at the earliest beginnings of culture or succumbed to conquest before they could mature, end quote. The aesthetic of a Greek and Roman world conceived of as a whole, and this is a quote from Woolf, a world closed unto itself, also something Woolf said, was translated by August Böck into his seminars, Institutional Practice. Böck was really the inventor of the seminar. And this had special consequences for scholars in North America because they attended German seminars in increasing numbers through the 19th century, brought that attitude, brought these values back to their new departments in the US and Canada, and indeed in South America increasingly as well. The philology of classical antiquity is a natural unit, Böcker wrote, because the classical is eminently worth knowing, and the culture of the Greeks and Romans is the foundation of our entire self-formation, our Bildung. So this is the potent and still immensely powerful construct I call in this one word, Greece and Rome. Its context is the emergent romantic concept of the nation itself, a tangle of beliefs about ethnicity and language, transhistorical cultural identity, or what the Germans like to call spirit. You mix this in with the tension between Europe and the Islamic Ottoman Empire, exacerbated by the early 19th century Greek call on fellow Christians of the Greek tradition and inheritors of the Greek tradition to support their fight for independence. Add the longing for, or we might say the fantasy of, total understanding of an entity defined as a closed-off unit, a world, the ancient world. So long as we learn the languages well enough and clarify the order of historical events accurately enough, we can gain perfect understanding of it. We can see with this mix how Greece and Rome became a prototypical nation before nations and a common quasi-ethnic origin story for 19th century imperialist Western Europe. Brooke Holmes, the classicist at Princeton, calls this tangle of ideas bioclassicism. And there are few advocates of bioclassicism more effective and unsettling than Friedrich Jacobs, editor of the Greek Anthology and a famous teacher with enormous influence over generations of young people through his long life. And I will let you read this silently while I take a drink of water. It's quite a quotation. One of the reasons I find this quotation so powerful and compelling and interesting to think about is the what I'm going to call the admirable intellectual excitement that animates him as he's talking about the new tools of research that are available in the early 19th century, combined with this fantasy of a world where he is discovering his ancestors. So the passion of new technologies is bound together with the passion he feels of finding the original political and cultural home of the German people. So we all know this history. Okay, we all know it. And as a field, those of us in classical studies or associate ourselves with the study of Greece and Rome, however we call it these days, we have chosen to live with it, to live with the knowledge of our field's origins, its allegiances, its persistent associations. I think for many of you who study, who work in the field, very little of what I've just said is news to you. And we've done this, I think, in the liberal confidence, which is not unadmirable, that and certainly not crazy. But we've done it in the liberal confidence that we can bracket ideas like this, that we can put them aside and move past the prejudices and limitations of ideas like Jacobs, and right the balance through the proper application of self-reflection and critique, and maybe even as many classicists in recent years have begun to propose with the development of something called critical classical studies that will embed within it a critical sensibility. That will be enough, right? And my question is it? Can we continue to live with the story? Can we continue to apply critical as an adjective and a set of values that will right these wrongs? Well, one reason this question is so tempting to evade, and I have to just spend a minute on why it is that classical texts have such a long history of attracting people who have courageously fought their way to a place at the table. One famous example of this, very early, is the Protestant theologian Olympia Murata, who spoke fluent Latin and Greek at the age of 12 and lectured on Cicero to the court of Ferrara as a teenager in the 1540s. And scholars of the history of classical studies started to tell 20 or 30 years ago the stories of many of Murata and many more such fighters, from Phyllis Wheatley to Frederick Douglass to W.E.B. Du Bois. And here I'm just picking, obviously, one set of examples from the Black American experience. With effort, even James Baldwin found ways to engage with the tradition. His essay, Why I Stopped Hating Shakespeare, is the best testament to that. In 2020, the president of the Modern Language Association, Simon Gikandi, a professor of English at Princeton, explained in his presidential address that he reads Euripides because, I quote, through the understanding of the sufferings and struggles of others, I can come to terms with my own past, end quote. Literature, Gikandi went on to say, can help us see how to live together across differences and divisions. And he quotes W.E.B. Du Bois on the sanctuary from the racist hate that canonical texts can provide. Du Bois said, you might know the quotation, I sit with Shakespeare and he winces not. And there are countless other examples, including those uncovered by Edith Hall and Henry Stead in their recent A People's History of Classics. And some scholars have seen in the achievements of those who fight their way into the classical world good reason to defend it as it is, on the grounds that, yes, it is possible to separate the texts and our methods for studying them from their origins and the baggage of Eurocentrism and European beliefs in European superiority, and not just European beliefs. We can, as the medievalist Carolyn Dinshaw suggests, queer our passion for past worlds, and that's her phrase. She argues that the desire for partial affective connection, for community, for a touch across time, to use her phrase, can serve, yes, all manner of dominant interests, from Sepulveda's defense of the natural slavery of indigenous Americans in the 16th century to toxic ethnic nationalism today. But she says studying past traditions can also incorporate a critical sensibility, justifying the activism of people who are resistant to the dominant order. So she casts relations to the past as a communal experience in which we come face to face with and must reflect on our own place in time and our obligations to the past and to other people. It's a somewhat Arendtian approach to the study of the past, and she's not alone in her purpose to queer time, as she puts it, or to draw an image from the French thinker Michel Serres, to crumple time, to see time as a handkerchief where widely separated points can be made adjacent, and from which then we can learn. But Ngugi wa Thiong'o, I think where I want to put in opposition to this seductive pull to think that it will be all right if we just simply bring the right attitude to our study. Wa Thiong'o calls for radical rethinking of categories and priorities in his manifesto for global comparative studies. It's not the best title in the world, I think, Global Ectics. The book came out in 2012. As a Kenyan writer with painful experience of the English language as a force of imperialism, Ngugi argues that the current distribution of knowledge in the humanities and the arts leaves fundamental historical, epistemological, and ethical questions untouched, undealt with. He says, we remain in a world, and this is my paraphrase, but he says, we remain in a world whose horizons remain bounded by the imaginaries of West and East, North and South, anchored by the prehistory of Greece and Rome, and that no amount of changing the values and attitudes and hopes we bring to that imaginary will change the fundamental inequity at its heart. So really now we come to the point. If we leave the core of classical studies as a field, really founding field in the humanities, if we leave it unchanged, if we keep reinforcing even just by living with it and bringing the right values to it, if we keep, and when I say right, I mean, values of curiosity, critical self-reflection, awareness of who's been excluded and so on. But if we keep doing that while still keeping the object of study more or less untouched, retaining Greece and Rome, even if we expand its temporal or adjacent regional borders to include Egypt or the western parts of the ancient Near East, can we, honest question, think critically about and still less dislodge the construct of the West that the field itself played such a powerful role in building? I think, as you can see, I'm skeptical. My own answer is no. And I think it's certainly well past time to have this conversation seriously and to start to take action about it. The certainties that prevailed over the past few hundred years that live so deep in our cognitive frameworks that have justified the organization of academic knowledge, and in many institutions still do. But it's 2024. We're nearly a century, certainly 75 years, into decisive changes to the global order that was established in the long 16th century. Emanuel Wallerstein, here on the bottom, put it succinctly. The old order, he said, was partly dismantled, first by the national liberation movements and then by 1968. It's also suffered from a structural undermining of its ability to continue the endless accumulation of capital that is its raison d'etre. This means, and this is really the takeaway point for us thinking about the university, about the humanities, and about classical studies, this means that we're called on not merely to replace this dying world system with one that's significantly better in terms of people's actual lives and the distribution of wealth, but to consider how we can reconstruct our structures of knowledge. Wallerstein is drawing his inspiration here from the Senegalese politician and poet Senghor, who's above him, who called on the world in often very lyrical terms to come to what he called the rendezvous, the meeting place of giving and receiving. How can we change our identity and practice to acknowledge the fact of the 21st century world, where the creation and distribution of knowledge itself is no longer the claim or the property of that very recent invention, the West? We need, I think, to design a new institutional framework, and I'm going to say frameworks because I think there will be many answers to this challenge for our labor. Frameworks that more accurately reflect the flows and exchanges of people and knowledge that constitute the world and the academy today. We need new disciplinary and departmental names and new scholarly values and new ways of educating that respond to the needs of the whole planet. If this new humanistic inquiry is decentered and plural, I think it has got to sustain the study of the world's pasts. And we're very much, I think, at a moment in the academy where thinking about decentering and reorganizing knowledge and devising new departments and new divisions, new faculty lines and so forth is very much in danger of completely abandoning the study of the past and only looking to the present and the future, which is why I'm emphasizing this so strongly. In an interview in a book called Flame Wars, The Discourse of Cyberculture, published in 1994, a landmark book that popularized the term Afrofuturism, the Black science fiction writer Samuel R. Delany on the left said this: "We need images of tomorrow, and our people need them more than most. But the historical reason we've been so impoverished in terms of future images is because until fairly recently, as a people, we were systematically forbidden any images of our past." And Delaney reminds us that the study of the past, and I'm thinking again of Hannah Arendt is a little bit of a ghost here in my thinking, the study of the past is an act of love at the end of the day. And I don't mean love of the past or its people or its artifacts per se. Some scholars love what they study. A lot of scholars don't at all. I mean rather what Arendt called amor mundi, love of the world and what humans have made of it in a more abstract but no less emotionally loaded way. And what we might make of the world if we understood ourselves better by understanding the past, as Delaney says we must do. So this is why I propose that Altertumswissenschaft, or classics, or classical studies, or ancient Greek and Roman studies, or ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern studies, all of these names that have begun to emerge over the last 20 to 30 years, that these formations should not dominate, should not persist, should not be the default in their current institutional form. In fact, I'll remind us that the organization of knowledge is already changing before our eyes. Increasing numbers of PhDs every year are employed in departments of world history and world literature and world culture and the humanities, right, writ large, or liberal studies writ large. And collectively, rather than bewail this shift, which is what I hear a lot of scholars doing, and I understand why, we can talk about that, but rather than just bewail it, we could also generate a form of study at every institution that opens its eyes to this aggregative organization, this focus on the world. And this, I think, will give us a stronger epistemological and ethical foundation and a more compelling institutional future. So in sum, what I'm proposing is that we celebrate and proactively contribute to the rebalancing of the specialized study of Greek and Roman texts and history that's dominated academic study of humanity's ancient pasts with the work of connecting and comparing with everyone, with scholars of Arabic, Chinese, Sanskrit, indigenous American languages, and that's just the beginning. We can make the most of our historically relatively strong position as experts in one branch of the science of antiquity to advocate for bringing the branches together into a single strong tree and conduct ancient studies on a global or planetary scale. Now, those of you who are tracking debates involving classical studies may be thinking, wait a minute, many departments around the country have already embraced neighboring cultures. They're teaching languages like Syriac and ancient Egypt, and isn't that enough? And I say, no. I'm skeptical of this. I'm skeptical of efforts to escape the power of what I call the Greece and Rome paradigm. Anyway, academia is already proudly global. We bring in faculty and students, the best faculty and students from all over the world. That's how we define and evaluate good universities, by how global they are. The greatest potential, it seems, for the study of the humanities, especially literature and culture, lies in building global chronopolitical alliances across disciplines that were split up 2 centuries ago for purposes that are not ours. Then we'll be in a position to reassess and return the past so as to infiltrate new futures into the present, if that makes sense. This ambitious global framing, I think, will help us sustain the study of all cultures and languages and the skills that we need to sustain to do that study all of these cultures that exist at a great distance from us. So in practice, this means we've got to put aside the term classical and classics. We've got to broaden our reach beyond North Africa and the Near East, and also beyond classical reception. We would reject the idea of just one single meaningful ancient world and stop referring to the ancient Mediterranean with that all too revealing shorthand. You still pick up books all the time in a library and bookstore, and I've used the phrase, I'm sure, a million times myself in my own writing, the ancient world, when I'm really only describing a piece. By co-creating and co-studying multiple ancient worlds, I think we can help redesign the borders of dominant region and race that classical studies was originally invented to define and defend. Because what are we? We, again, scholars still called classicists, we are expert constructors of meaning out of very limited resources. We're experienced in thinking about time, about historicism, about the accuracy of texts. These are hugely important issues for contemporary life and society today. Global study would mean new priorities. It's true. It would mean the loss of old ones, and that will be painful. But these new priorities would make the most of our skills and experience. Classical studies has a history of interdisciplinary collaboration. It is the world's first area studies. We are translators of language that live in writing rather than spoken speech. At ACLS, I can see from my perch there, I can have a sense of the new work that urgently needs doing with the skills that we have, with primary sources alone, requiring linguistic and archaeological skills that, in my view, all too few people are studying these days. Writing the history of understudied regions, such as the Nubian kingdoms of Kush and Meroe, featured in a glorious exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum, wonderfully reviewed by Peter Brown in the recent New York Review of Books. Studying the understudied exchanges of Mesopotamia and empires to the west. Comparative studies of artifacts and texts in the Mediterranean and ancient America, as called for by David Graeber and David Wengrow in their The Dawn of Everything. The history of the global circulation of ideas, particularly the nuanced study of indigenous thought cited by Ned Blackhawk in his 2023 book, The Rediscovery of America. The mission of literary studies in a post-Western, post-canon, internet, planetary scale. And these are just a few of the, in my view, kind of most urgent areas of study, but you will have your own, I hope. I don't pretend that this reformation will be easy, or that we can even know before we do it exactly where it will lead. But if we can find the forms of language in the plural that allow us to explore the relations between cultures of affiliation, recognition, and even antagonism, we can, as Sylvia Winter, who's behind me now, has compellingly enjoined us to do, we can undertake a collective rewriting of knowledge as we know it. And what's more exciting than that? Moving beyond the critical take, identifying the assumptions that have bent and colored scholarship of prior decades and centuries, we can work, I think, in a spirit of combined humility and aspiration for accuracy and clearer insight, devising the new scholarly habits and styles and collaborative assemblages and values and notions of merit that will allow us to remake a richer but really more accurate ancient worlds, in the plural. Sustained work in this mode will force us to develop better frames and have kind of more interesting arguments, I think, than the ones we've been having about pluralism and multiculturalism, which tend to conceal the revival of familiar patterns of domination and familiar complaints. I don't think it will be easy either. And the political theorist John Donne, even as he argues for a global approach to the history of political thought, checks his readers with a warning. He says, who can presume to think for a first-person plural as broad as the world's human population? And I think it's a good question, but he has a good answer too. The dangers of overreach and error are clear, but the epistemic and the cultural need for the work we can do is so urgent that I think we must try. We must forge new groups to think together across borders of discipline, area study, nation, language, and continent to test what we can do. So Donne's emphasis on new gatherings and new assemblages brings me back, as I move to a close, to Hannah Arendt and her essay, Introduction into Politics. Arendt wasn't talking here about the humanities, she was talking about politics, but her words are useful nonetheless. She said, if someone wants to see and experience the world as it really is, he, she says, can only do so by understanding it as something that's shared by many people, that lies between them, separates and links them, showing itself differently to each and comprehensible only to the extent that many people talk about it and exchange their opinions and perspectives with one another over against one another. Arendt is talking here about world making, the creation of a shared world of thought, creativity, experiment, and common purpose. She saw the purpose of the university as enabling world making, thanks to its ability, unparalleled, she thought, and I agree, to convene people across generations around the activity of talking together about texts, ideas, and works of art. Our planet is getting small and smaller all the time, thanks to technology and access to travel and economic and academic globalization. So especially as groups historically separated by space, come into closer and closer contact with one another, the work that we urgently need to do as scholars of the ancient world in the context of the humanities more broadly is the work of bridging national and linguistic and cultural and religious divides. Making this priority the grounding principle of the way we group ourselves and design curricula would mean redistributing the time and energy we spend now preserving the specificity of human experience in the groups humans have formed over time toward the work of connecting, comparing, contrasting, and mutually, I hope, understanding the results of our studies in their global context. One piece of European intellectual history helps clear the path. The humanists of the 16th and 17th century tended to spread their nets, cultural and linguistic, pretty widely. They devoted the bulk of their energies, it's true, to editing and interpreting Latin and Greek texts, but they were deeply interested in the study of Hebrew for obvious reasons, but also Chaldean or Aramaic and Egyptian. Pico della Mirandola's citation of Jewish and Egyptian knowledge in his Oration in Praise of Humanity in 1486 is one example of the expansive humanist vision that intellectual historians have explored in recent years very much as the path not taken. And perhaps the best example of another path not taken for academic scholars of the past is the late 16th, early 17th century scholar Isaac Casaubon, who on this wonderful book by Tony Grafton and Joanna Weinberg, they show him as considering Hebrew of equal value with Latin and Greek. He was frustrated by his still limited access in the 17th century to other languages. He knew about the study of Chinese, he knew about Arabic, he couldn't quite get the skills to study them. In the early 19th century, a few scholars, influential scholars who sought to perpetuate the humanist field of curiosity can also inspire us now. The poet and translator Friedrich Schlegel eloquently advocated for the study of Sanskrit in ancient India, although without much success, he was expelled from the Austrian Academy for his temerity in advocating for the study of Sanskrit along with Latin and Greek. But rather than focusing on the evolution of particular traditions, which Schlegel complained tended to favor stories about European progress or triumph, he said we should seek to identify and understand human essences and archetypes around the world. So this new ancient world studies, which I've tried to kind of impressionistically provoke us to think about, think with, maybe think against for some of you, maybe most, it may feel a little bit from our perspective today like a Tower of Babel. Lots of things going on, too many paths, almost too much to hold in our minds. But my very strong sense is that a bold institutional move along these lines would aid us, not just in perpetuating and justifying and sustaining a dynamic intellectual life in the university, but in the formidable task we face of living together on this planet under conditions of increasing hatred and fear. My proposal, and I know this is grandiose language, but I really believe this, my proposal is a bet on the humanity of humanistic studies and on the awareness in most of us that human collective life is facing conditions of real emergency, and that we have, and we should have the confidence to, in our capacity, to extend mutual comprehension among human beings who are very different all around the world. Now, this comprehension will always thin out as we move outward from the core and away and across from our comfort zones. But I think of the Afrofuturist and organizer Janaea Khan, who said, we have to be really creative and we have to find joy in each other. As much as it might be easy to think that all we talk about is revolution, we also talk about joy and the type of world that we're creating, because we understand that revolution isn't just the ending of something, it's the beginning of something new, something that has a larger table, that has more people at it, something that feels more collaborative. So should we succeed, I think the field of ancient studies, global ancient studies, ancient world studies, however we want to call it, and we'll call it a lot of things, we will have done a service for all the arts and sciences. We will have taken an important step forward in integrating the many worlds of scholarship and the two worlds of the academy and the human society whose space the academy occupies. We have the power to make worlds and to unleash that power Let's first remember that the modern research university that structures our scholarly lives was invented by and bears the scars of the 19th century globe, dominated by the divided competitive nations of Europe. But it's this blue marble that we inhabit, to which we owe now. So today I've tried to, and we'll see what you think in a moment, but I've tried to advocate for the development of techniques of care for the past that amount to a humanistic ethic for study that connects the planet, not just of and for Greece and Rome and its adjacent areas. Our care for the past, I think, must look beyond the times and spaces on the old maps. The classical world is an outdated term. It's doing us more harm than good. We've got to get rid of it. It encourages too much inward study at the moment when we need to see all the ancient worlds on our planet. The ancient world, that phrase we usually use now, as I said, to refer exclusively to the ancient Mediterranean and its neighbors, should encompass the entire planet, defined in different time frames, defined differently by indigenous peoples and by colonizing ones. But this is the work, and we all stand invited to assist in it. The work is inspired by care for others, living and dead, and not yet alive. Thank you very much. Oh, now we
You'll have to take a seat up to center in order to invite the room to respond to your provocative but very inspirational remarks.
thank you, and I welcome debate. Yes, yeah, I should grab water before. I am appropriately carrying a bottle that comes from a recent trip where I went shark cage swimming. So I am ready for all
Ready.
comers.
For the sharks in the room. Very good. Well, I'm going to throw open the floor and invite anyone who has a question to raise a hand. And I don't know, Siobhan, if you've got any questions already online. There's one already online, so we might turn to that first.
Yeah. So this is from Judith Hallett. Thanks so much for presenting this important intellectual challenge as essential for us lovers of the classical past to embrace. I would be interested in your thoughts about different ways in which classicists can acquire further interdisciplinary knowledge after completing graduate study in departments which cling to a narrow definition of what's worth studying about the past.
Yes, I mean, this is it. Thank you, Judy, for asking that question. So there are, I'll put kind of several things to think about on the table because it's a huge question. And it's also one that that people are going to answer differently depending on their department and their university. I think differently funded institutions will have appropriately, I think, different answers. Because I mentioned Harvard and its website earlier, I'll say, take a place like Harvard and probably Toronto as well, where you have the wonderful burden, I'm guessing, of endowed chairs. Certainly Harvard does, that are specified legally to support certain even sometimes topics as well as areas of study like Greek philology. So there will be questions of resources that shape institutions' answers to these questions of application. And I want to be honest about that, both so that we think more carefully about it, but also to acknowledge the plural of any answer to this. So material conditions for the supportive study is one piece to think about. Two more. One is, and Judy already mentioned this, implicitly, I think, the reward structure that we have in place to incentivize some approaches to study and decentivize, if that's a word, discourage people from pursuing others. And Judy also mentioned this implicitly too. She said after graduate studies, we live in such a highly professionalized world. Part of the fight, this is really the third thing I was going to say, professionalism. Part of the fight is to take from the language of the professional those aspects of it that were designed or at least now function to ensure, equity and consistency in the way we judge the standards that we have, but throw away those aspects that threaten to become immutable, that get too fixed, that become rigid and dogmatic, and that also present certain milestones like gaining the PhD as real endpoints or, kind of massively important markers in a person's intellectual life, which is a complete fantasy. And anyone who's either working on a dissertation or who has done it knows what a fantasy it is. Nothing happens to you, magically when you finish that period of life. So, kind of massaging not throwing all the accoutrement of professionalization out the window because they do ensure fairness and consistency, but massaging those moments and acknowledging that the faculty, particularly faculty reward structure we have in place now, which demands the completion of a very rigid piece of work called the dissertation and a very rigid piece of work called the first monograph, that these are things that are holding us back. So that, you can see I'm going intentionally very far afield because I think Judy's question uncovers just how much work we have to do in thinking about not just changes of reading lists or changes in what we expect of students coming into doctoral programs, really in any field, but we're talking about classical studies in particular now, but the whole arc of a person's career, if we're serious about devoting our scholarly lives to matters and areas of study that are life's work, and so I think embracing the life arc, not that everyone's going to pursue it in the same way or within the academy through their whole lives, but embracing that temporality and remaking the milestones and merit points of a scholar's life more fluid, delaying them in some cases, finding other ways to pay people better earlier on that don't depend on the fictive milestones of mastery. All of that is going to happen to make this happen.
Well, thank you for Judith.
Very capacious answer.
Yeah.
I see some hands waving in the breeze, so we'll invite Professor Brun.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah, I'm thinking a little bit about languages and thinking ahead then. So do you think that we'll be able to rely on AI in the future? So we'll in our, well, why not even start with the undergrads, but also at the graduate level, we let go of Greek and Latin and trust AI to cover everything we need. But I guess that would probably also apply to studying of African languages and indigenous languages in North and South America and Asian languages. So AI takes care of all the languages and then people can focus on other things. And I suppose maybe we who still live then, we would only have English and probably Chinese, because for the rest, it's AI, and then we can all understand each other somehow. I mean, thinking ahead, these are important questions that you raise for sure. Thank you.
Wow, I rarely find myself in the position because I've talked about this. I've been working on this book, which I'm really hoping to finish this spring, for a couple of years now. So I've had a few of these conversations, and I've rarely been put in the moment of thinking, that's a bold idea. I have not yet really wrapped my mind around. Let me say one thing. I think I'm not. Let me say one thing about the study of language. Let me take a step back and say this. Right now, the study of Latin, Greek in the Greece and Rome paradigm of classical studies is really warped and distorted. We require notionally the same level of mastery. I'm not saying this really happens in practice, but we notionally require the same level of mastery for undergrad in many undergraduate programs and many PhD programs, most I would say, of scholars, whether they're planning to study the ancient economy, whether they're going into archaeology, whether they're doing ancient demography or studying the novel and or studying philosophical texts. And it's crazy and it doesn't work. And we all know it doesn't work, but we are very worried about changing it because we're worried about a million things. Enrollments in our Latin and Greek classes, how to sustain the study of Latin and Greek when we don't have this kind of false and emotionally and mentally damaging structure, but we can't figure out a way to get out of it. That's my analysis of the kind of the language problem in the field as it is now. So I emphasize it as a problem because any alternative is also going to be is going to come with problems, but that's okay because the system we have now also has problems. So, I mean, ideally we'd figure out a better way to do it, but we're certainly not doing it the right way now by kind of uniform, fictive, and as I said, often kind of damaging requirements, certainly damaging intellectually because people who, I can think of a couple of colleagues, Dimitri Nakasis of Colorado, for example, who's written very compellingly about how archaeologists, they've got a lot to learn. They've got various, everything from chemistry, from working with anthropologists to working with how to cultivate and preserve, how to excavate and preserve material remains. And we're asking them to study Latin and Greek to some notional level of competence. I mean, maybe some of them will want to, but why are we requiring it? And yet most PhD programs in North America do require it. So again, I'm beating a dead horse, but just the situation now is not good. But but I think kind of getting to your question about AI and teaching languages that we're no longer speaking, but reading from texts, here is my most Arendtian thing that I'll say all day, which is for those who wish to and who find this study valuable, so not the archaeologists who want to study soil samples and who resent their Latin requirement, but for the people for whom that study is crucial, I think the best defense of studying language and not ceding it to AI is exactly the kind of ethical, epistemological, and epistemological attention and care for human communication, without which, and maybe I'll start sounding like a Luddite here, we risk losing an essential capacity of us as human beings. So I think now the path we're on by linking the study of Latin and Greek to the classical legacy and this kind of bioclassical tradition, it's a losing game. But for all the reasons I talked about in my lecture, but also because of enrollments and the sorry story they tell. So to recast it in a global frame and to make it about communication, both kind of deep engagement with a language, but that's not tied to this baggage, but is about communication across our planetary pasts, that's a better future, and it's a better argument, and reclaims that study as profoundly human and not as an AI job, which isn't to say that AI can't help us. So I'm not using it as a tool, totally fine with. Giving it over? No. But we can't, but we will be forced to do that unless, if we don't come up with a better framework to in which to kind of hold this study. That makes sense. It's a really good question.
Thank you, Joy. And I want to thank you for mentioning our erstwhile colleague, Dimitri Nakasis, too, who of course studied Linear B, so at his command, many, many languages. I saw a hand over in that corner, and I promise to come back to you, Don.
Thank you. I just had a pithy case in point for the previous question too. Nobel Prizes for literature are given to both the translator and the author equally. There's a reason for that. Once AI can mimic that, we have bigger problems. But my actual question was, so much of the distant past, once we start deconstructing all of our problematic sources, we're not left with very much in terms of primary material to work with, or we have primary sources that are actually written 200 years after the events they're describing, and we treat them like they're a primary source. And well, that's questionable. But once we start pulling on that thread, what is left? And is there a risk that because there's so little, it's open to 1,000 different interpretations, and we lose the narrative that, while it's wrong or it's simplistic, that Greece and Rome provides, for example? And for the non-academic audiences, I think a compelling narrative is pretty important. Yeah.
Yeah, it's another, I mean, all great questions. The book by Bill Reddings, it's a wonderful book called The University in Ruins. It came out in the 90s. He unfortunately died in a plane crash before he could finish it. He was really young, he was in his 30s. But the book did come out, and the reason I mention it in relation to this is that it's one of the best diagnoses I know of, and best histories of the university, kind of capital U, as a place in part developed, but certainly, sustained as a holder and a preserver of national identity. And one of Redding's questions was, in the course of the 20th century, as people in, academics themselves and people outside academia, politicians and the like, citizens started getting suspicious for a whole bunch of reasons of the nation state mission for the university and maybe nation states in general. The question was, well, what is the university really about if it's not about a national tradition? And his answer, which is scathingly sarcastic, is, oh, we became about excellence. And the whole book is a takedown of the meaninglessness of that word as it kind of took shape in this discourse. And he ends up in this very kind of, to my mind, kind of very frightening kind of individualistic world where he says, like, we're really kind of all on our own and all we can do is our best, and in the classroom, and it's not a bad answer on its own. But what seems to me to be missing from it, and which is, my best answer to the new narrative, is that, and the world we're living in, and the concerns, I think, of especially the rising generation with environmental collapse, and the need to understand, like, the obligation to understand and empathize with and make our problem the problems of places that are going to suffer more quickly from climate change than even we, now I say we, just where we are in North America, are going to suffer. That's a compelling story for the study of history and culture for a lot of, at least American undergraduates, from the research that I've read about why the decreasing numbers of American undergraduates still studying the humanities and social sciences are studying them. Climate change is a big driver in that, and understanding and polarization and understanding the need to communicate across difference is another big driver in that. So for me, the story of the planet and understanding planetary, social, human, and non-human development in the context of the whole planet, like, that's a powerful anchoring story we're just beginning to learn how to, like, talk about. So that's my best answer, really, to that. And it's big and it's messy, but if there's one thing we've taken on board, I think since roughly, let's just say 1968, it's that the fictions of clean ordering are not just inaccurate, but they do harm. So embracing that messy narrative and saying, yeah, understanding ancient past worlds, understanding ancient pasts of the whole planet, it's a big mess, but if you study this, or if you read, you are going to get a purchase on it. You're going to get ways in. And to say one final thing, the skills you learn along the way of, distinguishing truth from falsity, learning what words mean and thinking really hard about that, thinking about historical sources, that's I think a reasonable frame in which to tell the story. Great question.
I think we have time for one more question. So I'm going to ask Donald if he wants to frame it.
Thank you. That was a really inspiring and wonderful talk. So thank you so much. I was interested in hearing your thoughts about the role of writing and texts and the study of texts in your call for a global study of the ancient world, because writing comes into being around the globe in different moments. And obviously there are other things you can study in material culture of various kinds. The archaeologists are studying all sorts of things, but you really did emphasize, and I think classics, insofar as I know it, I'm not a classicist myself, I'm a philosopher. In my field, it's all about texts, right? So we're trying to globalize our philosophy curriculum. We're looking to, the ancient world of the literary cultures. So, China and India and elsewhere. But it's harder to do that and have a truly global perspective when the very discipline itself seems to depend on writing. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the history of writing and how it impacts the argument you've been making.
Yeah, that's, and I think my answer falls in three parts. The first is really short. There is more out there than we know. That's one answer. And I myself have been experienced real moments of shame, kind of hitting my early 50s and realizing how many ancient texts exist out there and traditions outside the ones I think I know a little bit about that I didn't even know existed until, so I would just say that whether we're thinking about ancient American texts or needless to say, the vast corpuses of Sanskrit and ancient Chinese and other Asian languages. So there's a lot there that we don't know exists, but it exists and it cries out for study. The second is tackling the challenge of understanding ideas expressed through oral history and traditions that are not textual in the way that's familiar to most of us in this room, or probably all of us, is another really fascinating question that, as you said, people are beginning to study, and that I think will be part of the answer to what you and your colleagues are doing in globalizing the curriculum. We some years ago, when I first got to ACLS, looked at and funded a project that was bringing to bear, in a quite radical way, current memories of people in Central Africa, but trying to tell the story of a pre-European contact Africa. And it was fascinating, and in and of itself, in terms of the ideas that emerged in dialogue with, between local African scholars, American scholars, Central African community members. There's just a whole world of fascination and compelling ideas to be worked through in what it is to come to even encounter an idea that isn't in a book, that I don't. So there's that too. This is a kind of variation on there's more out there, but this is more tackling the challenge of traditions and areas of the world that aren't textual at all and aren't published. Lastly, I think this is more of an argument in terms of comparison. I see immense energy and confidence among that gives me energy and confidence when it comes to the unpredictability of comparative study, and I think getting comfortable with that discomfort is going to be one of the biggest challenges of maybe my generation and the generations coming up of not knowing of where our investigations of comparative studies are going to lead us. And maybe I should stop there, but kind of the globalization is not a globalization of a curriculum, I think is not an act we should be able to see even the beginnings of the end of. And that's hard. And I come back where I started with the problems of professionalism and the demands to, specify learning outcomes and, put learning in a box. This really pushes hard against that, which I think is one of the best arguments in its defense. But it's going to it's going to encounter all kinds of professional, structural, institutional, and probably personal pushback from people who want to see ends and outcomes. This doesn't let us do that. And I suspect the work you're doing is you're encountering this already. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy. I'm going to turn the floor back over to Marcus to wrap up the evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. You leave me very thoughtful. We'll have time to talk a little more about this. Having received my training in Germany, I tend to become quite defensive when when languages are in play and when language acquisition is important. So that's on the one side. And then on the other side, really the need to reform the humanities in ways that keep them relevant in today's world and that make them less exclusive, I guess, to some degree, and much more important again in the concept of university education. So thank you very much. I think this is a lecture that will hopefully inspire many people to think more, to connect more for sure across disciplines. So I'm very grateful for this wonderful lecture, also in view of the fact that a college is a collegium, is the bringing together of colleagues from various backgrounds. So thank you very much. So this concludes tonight's lecture. I would like to first, of course, thank our speaker, Joy Connolly, for a really inspiring talk. Thank you, the audience, both here and I'm always pointing in the ether online for your great and thoughtful questions. Alison Keith for moderating, Siobhan O'Flynn for moderating the virtual Q&A. Staff at UC for organizing and running this event, and everybody really, students, staff, faculty involved in planning of Joy Connolly's visit here. I'd like to plug in for the remaining, we have this endowed lecture series, as many of you know, in various disciplines. Like to make a plug for the other public lectures here at UC in this term, here in the Paul Cadario Center, as well as on Zoom. There's the Alexander Lecture in English Literature on March 11th at 4:30. Deirdre Lynch, Harvard University, with the title, The Revolt of the Papers, or Bits and Pieces Towards a Feminist Theory of Scrap. And then the 2024 Priestley Lectures in the History of Ideas, March 25th to 27th, also at 4:30 here and online. Matthew J. Smith, University College London. The whole group has the title Free Island Overtures, first lecture on chance and discordance in 1950s Haiti. The second lecture, Caribbean Freedom from Slavery, the First 5 Decades, and the third lecture, 5 Years of Revolutionary Time in Jamaica, 1971 till 76. So I hope to see many of you there. Now it is time, at least for those of you who are present or for those of you who are following from very close, maybe from your offices, to join us for the reception right next door, where you will get a chance to perhaps chat amongst colleagues, but also with our wonderful speaker a little more over a drink and a nibble to eat. So I invite all of you to join us over there next door in the senior common room. But let me first and foremost thank our speaker once again, and please join me.